Well, we are continuing our series looking at the gospel according to David. In this series, we are trying to see how the Old Testament King David demonstrates, receives, and desperately needs the grace of God, just like Jesus' disciples. Last week, we saw that David continually turned to God in prayer. He lived a life of prayer. We were encouraged to spend more time in conversation with Jesus this past week. Thank you to everyone who sent me your prayer triggers for this past week. This week we are seeing how David prepared for his many battles. If you notice, I'm going to be bouncing between 1st and 2nd Samuel for our readings today. David's story is divided between 1st and 2nd Samuel. And generally, 1st Samuel, he is a boy or a young man while Saul is king. And in 2nd Samuel, that's where David becomes king himself. Our first text was about a battle from his time as king. And our main text today is actually about a battle from a time when he was a young adult before he became king. In fact, during this time, for our main text today, David was fleeing away from Saul, who was trying to kill him. David had a number of men who were loyal to him and followed him into his exile. And so we will tune in to see how David behaves while he is chased, harried, and threatened. That usually does not bring out the best in people, but let's see what David does. 1 Samuel chapter 23. Now they told David, the Philistines are fighting against Keilah and are robbing the threshing floors. David inquired of the Lord, shall I go and attack these Philistines? The Lord said to David, go and attack the Philistines and save Keilah. But David's men said to him, look, we are afraid here in Judah. How much more then if we go to Keilah against the armies of the Philistines? Then David inquired of the Lord again. The Lord answered him, yes, go down to Keilah, for I will give the Philistines into your hand. So David and his men went to Keilah, fought with the Philistines, brought away their livestock, and dealt them a heavy defeat. Thus David rescued the inhabitants of Keilah. When Abiathar, son of Ahimelech, fled to David at Keilah, he came down with an ephod in his hand. Abiathar was a priest. Now it was told Saul that David had come to Keilah. And Saul said, God has given him into my hand, for he has shut himself in by entering a town that has gates and bars. Saul summoned all the people to war to go down to Keilah to besiege David and his men. When David learned that Saul was plotting evil against him, he said to the priest Abiathar, bring the ephod down. David said, O Lord, the God of Israel, your servant has heard that Saul seeks to come to Keilah to destroy the city on my account. And now will Saul come down as your servant has heard? O Lord, the God of Israel, I beseech you, tell your servant. And the Lord said, he will come down. Then David said, and will the men of Keilah surrender me and my men into the hand of Saul? And the Lord said, they will surrender you. Then David and his men, who were about 600, set out and left Keilah. They wandered wherever they could go. When Saul was told that David had escaped from Keilah, he gave up his expedition. David remained in the strongholds in the wilderness, in the hill country of the wilderness of Ziph. Saul sought him every day, but the Lord did not give him into Saul's hand. This is the word of the Lord, so thanks be to God. Well, Thomas Huxley was in Dublin, Ireland, and he was running late. He had to get across town quickly or he would miss his train, so he flagged down a taxi and hopped in and shouted at the driver, hurry, I'm almost late, drive fast. The driver nodded. Taxi shot out like a cannonball, and relieved, Huxley closed his eyes and actually nodded off to sleep. When he awoke, he realized they were headed in the wrong direction, and he cried out to the driver, don't you know where you're going? The driver said, no, sir. You never told me where to go, but I'm driving very fast, just like you told me. How fast are you moving right now? Some people I know are having to move even faster during this time. Some people I know are grudgingly moving slower during this time, unable to do their normal routine. Some people I know are relishing the doldrums of inactivity how fast are you moving right now? And whether you are watching the snails pass you by or moving faster than any blazing space-bound rocket, or maybe you're moving but you're stuck in a kind of low gear, no matter how fast you're going, do you know where you're going? If we are ever to take 2 steps forward, even if it means we must take 1 step back, we must first know which way is forward and which way is back. Do you know where you're going? David has a fascinating understanding of where he's going. In our text today, his ragtag army of 600 men had just narrowly escaped Saul's much larger force. They knew that Saul meant business, because when Saul heard that some of the priests had given David some food, he killed them and their families. The priest in our text today, Abiathar, was one of the few survivors of that massacre, and now he was on the run with David. So let's try to imagine this. If you were on the run, if you were in hiding, if you were, to quote the musical Hamilton, outgunned, outmanned, outnumbered, outplanned, would you go and pick a new fight with a new enemy? Doesn't seem to be a wise strategy to me. It seems like a dangerous distraction from their number one objective, which was to survive long enough to make David the king over Israel. But when David heard that their age-old enemy, the Philistines, were once again raiding a city of Israel, our text said he inquired of the Lord. I don't think that translation quite carries the right tone, though. It really implies he begged God for guidance. He didn't ask politely for a few hot tips from God, or maybe some stock picks while you're at it. He begged God for guidance. And he did that. He begged God for guidance because David knew where he was going. His destination was not just the kingship of Israel. David's true destination was wherever God was leading. David's goal did not define his direction. God defined David's direction. And so David begged God for guidance. Shall I go and attack these Philistines? Listen to the specificity of those words. Shall I? Not help me attack these Philistines. Shall I? Interesting, very specific choice of words. Then he asks, shall I go and attack? You see, Keilah was a walled city. He could have gone and defended the city, but instead he asked if he should go and attack. Interesting and very specific choice of words. Then he asks, shall I go and attack these Philistines? Not all the Philistines, not some Philistines, these Philistines. Very interesting and specific choice of words. And God responds to those interesting and very specific words with an affirmative reply. But David's men, they don't like that one bit. I mean, they were incredulous. We were afraid. We are on the run. Why should we take on the Philistines too? And so David, once again, interestingly, begs God for guidance again. Let's stop there for a second, because David was willing to listen to his men. David's willing to entertain the thought that he had heard God incorrectly. He might have misinterpreted the signs. You ever done that? Ever gone in the wrong direction even though you tried your best to figure out where God wanted you to go? I heard an interview recently with Payal Kadakia, the co-founder of ClassPass. Just reached $1 billion valuation earlier this year. Basically, they provide access to a bunch of boutique fitness classes, and they provide access to all those different boutique studios all in one place around the country. And Payal told of the early journey of what eventually became the company, ClassPass. She told her boss that she was quitting her job to start this new company. She told her boss about the idea for this company, and her boss loved the idea and gave her a $10,000 check on the spot to help her start it. while she was in the midst of quitting his company. When she told her launch idea to one of her longtime friends, he asked, "Can I quit my job and come help you start that?" They were connected with a tech startup incubator in New York City. They emerged from that experience with a finished product and $500,000 of funding. They were getting rave reviews from all over the tech world. And when they finally launched the site to great expectation, as you might guess from such a surefire, can't-miss, well-funded, well-planned startup, they had literally zero sales. They even tried giving the fitness classes away, and no one took them up on the offer. That's when they knew that they had clearly built a product that people in technology loved, but people who wanted to take fitness classes didn't. They had totally missed their mark, despite all those good vibes. After 6 or 7 total reimaginings of the company, they finally found the right combo. But it took Pyle admitting that several years' worth of work and $500,000 had been wasted, going in the wrong direction. How do you know when you are headed in the wrong direction? How do you know when you've sought God's guidance, you thought you received the guidance, and yet somehow you still heard incorrectly? David knew that it was possible he got this one wrong. And so he begged God for guidance a second time. And God answered again in the affirmative, confirming the earlier guidance. Now, this should be a great encouragement to all of us. God is generally fine if we ask, "Are you sure, God?" I've taken it a step further a few times in my life when I'm pretty sure I know where God is leading, but it seems crazy. I have sometimes prayed, "God, derail this if I got it wrong." Sometimes He's done exactly that. Other times, I was correct in getting God's direction, even though it seemed crazy. If you are in doubt of whether you got God's guidance correctly or not, if you're in doubt, feel free to copy David and ask, "Are you sure, God?" David's willingness to consider that he was wrong actually saved his life here. Surely the residents of Keilah would appreciate being saved, right? Surely they would be loyal to David, their deliverer, right? Wrong. David thought to ask God, "Will they turn me over to Saul?" And God warned him to leave. How do you check with God if you might have gotten something wrong? Well, to recap, David continually sought God's guidance. In fact, he begged for God's guidance. He lived a life seeking God's guidance. He didn't assume he was on the right track. He checked in with God continually to see if he was on God's track. David was willing to double check if he was right or not. David was willing to change course when God said he was wrong. David was willing to attack when God said attack. David was willing to run away when God said to run away. He was willing to be sneaky whenever God said to be sneaky. David tried to stay in alignment with God. Now, that did not keep him in alignment with God at all times. He messed up, and big time. But even then, he radically changed his direction when he was confronted with how out of alignment he was with God. That gave him the ability to check where he was and where he was headed. Being out of alignment with God is kind of like the tires on your car being a little out of alignment. We have a Chevy Volt, which is what I would call a mostly electric car. Has a gas motor as a supplement, but usually you're driving around on battery. And electric cars, even a mostly electric car, they need much less mechanical maintenance than other cars. And so I can go a long time between visits to the mechanic for maintenance, but that also means that some things that normally happen, like whenever you get an oil change, like rotating your tires or checking alignment, those don't happen unless you specifically schedule them. We have totally wrecked the tires on our Volt just by having them be slightly out of alignment and not rotating them. The car will still go where we want it to go, but it's chewing the tires away. When we are out of alignment with God, we might still go where we want to go, but we're chewing up our souls along the way. When we are out of alignment with God, we are burning the rubber of our souls. So how do we get back into alignment? Well, imagine that you're hanging a picture or a mirror. How do you make sure that it is hanging straight on the wall? You might eyeball it by, taking a few steps back and seeing if it looks level. You might actually go get a level to make sure 100% that it is precisely level. And if it's off, what do? You might adjust it, right? Aligning our souls with God is a process of checking and adjustment. Am I thinking more or less like Jesus over the last week? Am I feeling godly emotions or very human emotions over the last week? Is my internal monologue more or less like Jesus over the last week? Are my spoken words more or less like Jesus over the last week? Are my temptations subsiding or growing? Are my actions more or less like Jesus over the last week? These are check-ins. Questions like these are how you check the level of your soul. And then the scary questions. God, what do you want me to do about it? God, how do you need to adjust my thoughts, my emotions, my words, my temptations, my actions? I encourage you to try to adjust your godly alignment this week. Check in with God to see if you are trending more or less like Jesus on the inside and on the outside, and ask God to help you make the adjustments you need to get back into closer alignment with God. Sisters and brothers, David continually checked his soul's alignment with God. He double-checked to ensure he had heard God correctly. He double-checked to ask God where he was going in the wrong direction. He shifted his behavior when he needed realignment. Will you do the hard work of checking and adjusting your godly alignment? Or are you content to let your picture be crooked in God's house? Amen.